I'm Walter Knight. I'm 45 years old, a senior project manager with 15 years at Dalton Engineering, a company I've grown into and helped grow in return. Over the years, I've built a reputation for reliability and precision, qualities that have earned me the trust of my colleagues, superiors, and clients alike. I'm the kind of guy who reads the fine print, double-checks the numbers, and keeps every piece of correspondence meticulously filed. It's not just about work, it's how I approach life. But nothing in any project plan or risk assessment prepared me for what would happen after I did everything I could to save my wife's life. Karen had been struggling with a rare cardiac condition for months, but the moment her doctor told us she needed emergency surgery, I knew there was no room for hesitation. The operation was going to cost nearly $120,000, an overwhelming sum, but one I was determined to face head-on. I sold my pride and joy, a 2015 classic Mustang that I'd restored over years for $70,000. That car wasn't just metal, it was memories, weekends spent under the hood, the smell of gasoline and oil, the roar of the engine on open highways. Saying goodbye to it felt like losing a part of myself. Next, I liquidated $36,500 from our joint savings account. Every cent I could spare, every dollar we had stored for vacations, emergencies, or retirement, I drained it. Then, in a final, painful move, I handed over my father's vintage tool set, worth $12,000. It was an heirloom, passed down to me with stories of hard work and family pride. I called an appraiser and accepted the price without haggling, because Karen's life was worth more than any tool or heirloom. I remember the hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of flowers. I sat by her bedside, watching the machines beep steadily, reminding me that she was still here, still fighting. Nurses would come in and out, offering polite smiles, but it was the silence between the moments that told the real story. 7 days later, she was out of surgery, recovering, and I thought everything would change for the better. I thought she'd see the sacrifice and appreciate it. Instead, 7 days after she left the hospital, I received the divorce papers. It was like a punch to the gut. She filed for divorce, demanding half of our combined assets, half of what little we had left after my sacrifices. She even petitioned for custody of our dog, Max, who had been my companion on lonely nights and my solace through the hardest days. I read through the papers, scanning the pages with a calm that surprised even me. I said nothing at first, just quietly uttered, "I see." Inside, though, my mind began calculating. Numbers ran through my head: $70,000 from the Mustang, $36,500 from the savings, $12,000 from the tools. That added up to $118,500. The emergency surgery had cost more than that, but financially, I had bled out to save her. Now, she wanted it all back, plus more. My mind wasn't spinning with anger or betrayal. It was strategizing, planning the next steps with the same meticulous attention I applied to every project I managed. I pictured the prenuptial agreement we had signed before the wedding, carefully negotiated, designed to protect each of us from exactly this kind of financial disaster. I knew the clause about gifts and medical expenses was clear. Assets used for emergency medical care were excluded from marital property claims. I'd kept every receipt, every bank statement, every appraisal. I had an advantage she hadn't anticipated. There was no shouting or desperation in me. I was calm, measured, ready to face the challenge not as a betrayed husband, but as a professional man who understood the power of documentation, contracts, and legal frameworks. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The day she filed the divorce, I packed a small bag and left our house. The thought of staying there, surrounded by memories and empty accounts, was unbearable. I found a cheap motel nearby, a small room with a flickering hallway light and thin walls. That night, I lay awake staring at the hallway, my mind racing, not with despair but with determination. This wasn't just about losing a marriage, it was about reclaiming control of my life and my future. I wasn't going to be a victim of circumstance. I was Walter Knight, Senior Project Manager. I knew how to build a plan and I was ready to execute it. At Dalton Engineering, I've built more than just a career. I've carved a niche defined by precision, foresight, and relentless attention to detail. Over the past 15 years, I've climbed the ranks methodically, starting as a junior engineer fresh out of college and steadily moving up to my current role as senior project manager. It's not just about the titles or pay grades, but the responsibilities and trust that come with them. One landmark project stands out: a massive $8.5 million endeavor to build the Riverside Bridge, a vital infrastructure link in our region. I was appointed to lead the project, overseeing a team of 12 engineers and technicians. From the outset, I was determined not only to meet the technical requirements, but to push the boundaries where efficiency and cost savings were possible. Every detail, every workflow was logged meticulously. I knew that in a project of this scale, small oversights could cascade into expensive delays or budget overruns. Our initial projections set the budget at $8.5 million with a completion timeline of 24 months. But by implementing streamlined procurement processes and optimizing labor schedules, we managed to trim costs significantly without compromising quality or safety. Through process improvements, like renegotiating supplier contracts and introducing just-in-time inventory controls, I saved the company $1.2 million. That figure wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it was a testament to the value of discipline, analysis, and steady leadership. When the project finished ahead of schedule and under budget, my reputation within Dalton Engineering solidified. I'm the guy who keeps records like a second skin. Meeting minutes, expense reports, progress updates. I archived them all, ensuring nothing was left to chance. This habit of detailed documentation extended beyond work. For years, I applied the same rigor to managing our personal finances, tracking every transaction, every joint account contribution, every large purchase. This habit wasn't born out of paranoia, but necessity. In a marriage, especially one with significant assets and shared financial goals, clear records are a safeguard against future misunderstandings. That meticulousness, cultivated over a decade and a half, made me both invaluable and vulnerable. While my colleagues relied on me to manage risk and anticipate problems before they arose, I never imagined those skills would be called upon in such a personal and painful way. I'd always believed that the same precision that brought success to the Riverside Bridge project, and many others, would protect my family's foundation. At work, I'm known for my calm under pressure, the ability to analyze complex data and make decisions that balance technical feasibility with financial prudence. This analytical mindset shaped how I approached Karen's medical crisis. I didn't just act on emotion. I assessed, planned, and executed a financial strategy to fund her surgery, even if it meant liquidating cherished assets and draining our savings. Those decisions were grounded in the same principles that guided my professional life: calculated risk, thorough documentation, and unwavering commitment to solving problems. Yet the personal stakes transcended any project deliverable or corporate milestone. The assets I sacrificed, the Mustang, our savings, and my father's toolset, were symbols of years of effort and legacy. Selling the Mustang wasn't just about freeing up cash, it was letting go of weekends tinkering under the hood, the smell of gasoline mixed with engine oil, and the pride of restoring a classic to its former glory. Handing over my father's tools felt like relinquishing a piece of family history, a tangible connection to my roots and the hard work that shaped me. At the same time, I continuously updated our financial records, not out of suspicion, but because responsibility demanded transparency. Every bank withdrawal, every appraisal of the tools, every sale contract for the Mustang was filed and backed up digitally. I knew that if the worst happened, I would have a clear, indisputable record. What I didn't anticipate was how soon I would need those records. Within the company, my reputation for reliability has meant I'm often the go-to person when complex challenges arise. I've been praised for managing large budgets, keeping projects on schedule, and maintaining calm in crises. These traits, forged over hundreds of projects, suddenly became the tools I needed for a battle far more personal and intricate than any engineering problem. Now, as I face the rupture of my marriage, those years of careful documentation and strategic thinking aren't just professional habits, they are my arsenal. The same diligence that helped me save $1.2 million on a bridge project will now help me navigate the labyrinthine process of a divorce that threatens to wipe away everything I've sacrificed. The juxtaposition is stark. A project that demanded collaborative teamwork, trust, and shared goals contrasts sharply with the isolation and betrayal I now feel. Yet, The through line remains the same. I rely on facts, contracts, and data, not emotion or impulse. My professional identity as a man who plans, executes, and delivers results is the foundation on which I will build my next steps. So, even in the quiet moments after being blindsided by the divorce filing, I return to the skills that have defined me. I review every document, every record, with the same focus I use to dissect structural blueprints and risk assessments. The details matter. The numbers tell the story. And in those numbers, I find the beginnings of a new strategy. Karen was 42, and from the start, there was a growing restlessness beneath her surface. A dissatisfaction she never fully voiced, but that became clearer as time went on. The woman I'd married wasn't just facing health challenges. She was wrestling with her own sense of identity and financial independence. I had always assumed that the sacrifices I made, selling my beloved Mustang, liquidating our savings, parting with my father's cherished tools, would be met with gratitude or at least acknowledgement. Instead, I found myself staring at divorce papers just 7 days after her surgery. A legal move so sudden and cold, it felt like a calculated strike. The truth, I realized, was more complicated. Karen's motivation wasn't born solely from bitterness or anger. Rather, it was a deliberate plan to secure her financial footing while minimizing her own risks. She eyed half of the remaining joint assets, the $118,500 worth of resources I had poured into her care, while obscuring the fact that she had contributed virtually nothing financially during this crisis. It was as if my sacrifices were invisible, overshadowed by her demands. What struck me was how she had overlooked the legal safeguards we had crafted together before our wedding day, the prenuptial agreement that delineated precisely what counted as marital property and what did not. That clause about emergency medical expenses was a shield I had carefully negotiated. It excluded gifts or asset transfers made explicitly for medical care from the pool of divisible marital property. I'd studied that document thoroughly, and I knew its language was clear and binding. Karen's haste to claim equal ownership of those assets betrayed either ignorance or a willful disregard for that clause. But more than legal technicalities, I was counting on the facts, the paper trail I had kept with obsessive care. Every bank statement showing the $36,500 withdrawal from our joint savings was archived. The Mustang sale contract for $70,000 sat neatly filed alongside the appraisal report for my father's vintage tools, which I'd sold for $12,000 without any negotiation to expedite the funds. She had no inkling of these records or the implications they carried. Then there was Helen Carter, our longtime family friend whose observations proved crucial. Helen had witnessed the exhaustion on my face during those long hospital days, had seen me make phone calls to appraisers and dealerships, had listened to my quiet resolve as I navigated this unthinkable financial burden alone. Her forthcoming affidavit wouldn't just bolster my claims, it would underscore the imbalance of sacrifice. Even Karen's own attorney was caught off guard by the strength of my documentation and the clarity of the prenuptial clause. Mark Reynolds, the divorce lawyer I retained, recognized immediately that Karen's strategy had significant flaws. She had underestimated the legal protections built into our agreement and the meticulous evidence I'd amassed. Where Karen sought to claim equality, Mark saw vulnerability in her position. There was an unsettling coldness to the situation, an opportunism that cut deeper than any emotional wound. Karen's demand for 50% of assets, including those I'd liquidated in her name, wasn't just about fairness, it was about securing a windfall at my expense, and the addition of custody claims over Max, our dog, my constant companion through sleepless nights and moments of despair, felt like a final affront. Still, I remained calm. My mind was already shifting from shock to strategy. Years of managing complex engineering projects had sharpened my ability to dissect problems, identify leverage points, and execute plans with precision. This was a different kind of challenge, but the tools were the same. I would rely on contracts, records, and sworn witness statements, not emotions or accusations. In that moment, I resolved to navigate this betrayal, not as a victim, but as a professional. Karen had underestimated the power of careful preparation and legal safeguards. I wasn't about to let her rewrite the story of my sacrifices or diminish the value of my contributions. The battle would be fought not in shouting matches or bitter recriminations, but in documented facts, legal clauses, and strategic action. I studied the prenuptial agreement once more, focusing on the clause excluding gifts and asset transfers for emergency medical care from the marital estate. It was explicit and unambiguous. The $118,500 I had provided should remain mine alone. I reviewed the bank statements, the sale receipts, the appraisal reports. Everything was in order, every number accounted for, every transfer documented. I had prepared for uncertainty, but not for betrayal so swift. Karen's urgency to file the divorce within a week of her recovery signaled intent more than desperation. It was a move designed to catch me off guard, to claim a share of assets before I could respond. But I was no stranger to fast turnarounds or high-pressure situations. My career depended on anticipating risks and mitigating them before they became crises. This was just another problem to manage, one that required patience, precision, and calm resolve. I also considered the potential role Helen Carter's testimony would play. As an outsider with no stake in the dispute, her affidavit about my financial sacrifices and Karen's detachment during the crisis would lend credibility to my case. Her observations would counter any claims Karen might make about equal contribution or shared burden. Ultimately, Karen's approach was a fatal miscalculation. By attempting to claim assets excluded by our prenuptial agreement, without recognizing my extensive documentation and legal counsel, she was setting herself up for systematic challenge and, quite possibly, defeat. I was ready to build my case layer by layer, the same way I'd built successful projects, methodically with an eye for detail and unwavering discipline. As the initial shock faded, a clear picture emerged. Karen sought financial security without the sacrifice. But I held the evidence to prove otherwise. The game had changed. I wasn't just defending assets, I was defending the integrity of the promises made, the work endured, and the life I was determined to rebuild. Carefully reviewing the divorce petition was like peeling back layers of a well-disguised plan. At first glance, Karen's demands appeared straightforward: 50% of all joint assets and custody of Max, our dog. But as I examined the fine print, a glaring inconsistency emerged. She included the full value of the $180,500 in assets I had liquidated to cover her surgery. That sum wasn't just a number, it was every penny drained from savings, the sale of my cherished Mustang, and the last of my father's vintage tool set. The same assets I'd sacrificed without hesitation now found themselves at the center of a legal storm, claimed as marital property despite the prenuptial safeguards we had agreed upon. I leaned back in the chair, hands steepled under my chin, and let my trained mind engage in a systemic cross-check. First, I pulled out the bank statements I had meticulously archived over the years. The $36,500 withdrawal from our joint savings account was there in black and white. Exact dates, bank teller signatures, transaction IDs. Nothing was out of place or unaccounted for. Beside those statements lay the sale contract for the Mustang, detailing the transaction amount, the buyer's information, and the date the car changed hands. The smell of gasoline and the hum of that engine felt distant now, but the records remained tangible proof of the sacrifice. Lastly, the appraisal report for my father's tool set was a crisp, professional document showing the $12,000 valuation and the subsequent sale. All these files formed an unassailable chain of evidence. Next, I turned to the prenuptial agreement. The clause about gifts and medical expenses was explicit. Any asset transfers or expenditures made expressly for emergency medical care were excluded from the marital property pool. The language was clear and unambiguous, a shield forged in legal precision. This clause had been negotiated painstakingly before our wedding, and I had kept it close, knowing its importance without fully imagining its necessity until now. It was a legal linchpin that Karen's claim seemed to ignore entirely. Then, there were the emails, messages exchanged between Karen and her attorney in the days leading up to the surgery and immediately after. They revealed an unsettling haste. She had communicated the intention to file for divorce as soon as she was physically able to stand in court. The timing wasn't coincidental but strategic. The tone was detached, almost transactional, a stark contrast to the vulnerability she displayed during hospitalization. This was no act of desperation. It was a calculated move to seize financial advantage. Helen Carter's forthcoming affidavit added another critical dimension. Helen had been a constant presence during that turbulent week, observing the exhaustion etched on my face, the sleepless nights spent coordinating logistics and payments, and the quiet diligence with which I managed every detail. Her statement described Karen's relative disengagement from the financial burden, painting a picture of imbalance that reinforced the legal argument. As a disinterested third party, Helen's observations carried weight that could not easily be dismissed. The more I catalogued and cross-referenced, the clearer the path became. Karen's oversight, perhaps born from overconfidence or ignorance, left open a legal vulnerability too significant to ignore. My documentation wasn't just thorough, it was bulletproof. Every dollar spent, every asset sold, every transfer made was accounted for with date stamps, signatures, and formal contracts. The prenuptial agreement's protections were explicit, and the witness testimony added credibility impossible to refute. Sitting there, a wave of calm resolve washed over me. No anger, no rash impulse, just the steady mind of a project manager accustomed to dissecting complex problems and building solutions from fact. This was no different from managing the Riverside Bridge project's intricate budget or negotiating vendor contracts. It was just a different kind of ledger, a different set of stakeholders. Karen's aggressive claim, including the emergency funds as marital property, was a critical misstep. It gave me the leverage to challenge the petition methodically and strategically. I could foresee the motions my attorney and I would file, the exhibits we would present, and the legal precedents we could cite. This was a chess game, and I was already several moves ahead. The intersection of legal precision and financial transparency was where I held the advantage. While Karen sought to rewrite the narrative of shared sacrifice, the documents told the true story, one of unilateral financial hardship borne by me alone. It was a story told not in emotion, but in receipts, contracts, and legal clauses. It was a story that, if told correctly, would change the course of this dispute. As I closed the folder and stood up, the magnitude of the battle ahead settled in. The divorce petition was just the opening salvo. But with these facts in hand, I felt ready to navigate the legal complexities and protect what I had sacrificed. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would I. This was not merely about recovery, it was about justice through systematic, professional rigor. I scheduled a consultation with Mark Reynolds the very next morning. Mark came highly recommended, a divorce attorney known for meticulous preparation and strategic thinking. I needed someone who wouldn't be blindsided by Karen's sudden move or the financial complexities she'd overlooked. When I sat across from him in his office, the scent of polished wood and fresh coffee grounding the space, I knew this was where my calculated approach would pivot into legal action. Mark listened carefully as I laid out the situation, describing the $118,500 in assets I'd liquidated to cover Karen's surgery, the Mustang, the savings, the vintage tool set. I explained the prenuptial clause that excluded gifts made for emergency medical care from the marital estate and highlighted the detailed documentation I'd kept. He nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the strength in that foundation. "Walter," he said, "this isn't just about emotional betrayal. It's a legal battle grounded in your evidence and contracts. Our first step is to create a chronological inventory of all relevant documents and transactions. Every receipt, every bank statement, every appraisal needs to be catalogued and backed up." Following his advice, I returned home and began the painstaking process of organizing. I pulled out folders filled with receipts, the Mustang's sale contract, dated and signed, listing the buyer's name, and the exact sale price of $70,000 was at the front. Beneath it lay bank withdrawal slips showing the $36,500 taken from our joint savings account. The signatures, timestamps, and teller confirmations echoed the undeniable trail of funds. Alongside those, the appraisal report and sale invoice for my father's tool set rested neatly in a clear plastic sleeve, its $12,000 valuation marked by a reputed local appraiser. I scanned each document, creating digital backups stored securely on an encrypted drive. No detail was too small to save. I then compiled medical bills and hospital statements totaling close to $120,000. These papers verified the timing and necessity of the surgery, underscoring that the money I had supplied was solely for this emergency. Every authorization form I had signed Authorizing payment transfers was included, further cementing the legitimacy of these expenses. Next, I drafted a timeline, an analytical framework that laid out each financial move with exact dates and amounts. March 3rd, sale of Mustang finalized. March 4th, bank withdrawal executed. March 5th, toolset appraisal and sale. March 6th through 8th, hospital payments processed. The timeline wasn't just a sequence, it was a story told through numbers and dates, painting a clear picture of my commitment and sacrifice. I also reached out to Helen Carter, our longtime family friend. I explained the situation and asked if she would formalize her observations in an affidavit. Helen, empathetic and meticulous herself, agreed without hesitation. Over a quiet afternoon coffee, she relayed her account. How she had seen me juggling hospital visits, calls to appraisers, and financial institutions. How Karen seemed emotionally detached from the mounting burden. How Max, our dog, had been a constant source of comfort to me during those long, lonely nights. Helen's words, documented under oath, would give the legal team invaluable third-party testimony. Throughout this process, I remained focused, keeping emotion at bay. Every action was deliberate, every document placed in strict order, every detail accounted for. It reminded me of managing complex projects at Dalton Engineering, no room for chaos, only systems and control. I also reviewed custody laws regarding pets, a surprisingly nuanced area. Since Max had been with me consistently during Karen's hospitalization and after, and given her neglect during the crisis as Helen observed, I felt confident in asserting my primary custodianship. I made notes about local statutes, court precedents, and potential custody arguments to discuss with Mark. By the end of the week, I had amassed a comprehensive, logically ordered portfolio: sale contracts, bank records, medical bills, witness statements, prenuptial clauses, and legal research. This wasn't just a file, it was the backbone of my defense and counterclaim. That night, in my modest motel room, I spread the documents across the small table. The flickering hallway light outside cast long shadows, but inside I felt a quiet certainty. I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing, building a case based on facts and law rather than feelings. Karen's sudden betrayal had opened a door, but I had already walked through it, stepping into a space where precision and patience would turn the tide. Mark's words echoed in my mind. Chronology and documentation are your greatest allies. If we can prove these assets were gifts for medical care, excluded from marital property, we hold the legal high ground. I repeated this mantra, letting it steady me. The next phase was clear: methodical, evidence-based, and resolutely professional. The game was on, and I was ready to play by the rules I knew best. Mark Reynolds sat across from me in his neatly organized office, the faint aroma of polished wood and fresh coffee filling the air. As an experienced divorce attorney, he exuded calm confidence. I needed that steadiness now more than ever. I laid out the details carefully. The Mustang sale for $70,000, the $36,500 withdrawn from our joint savings, and the $12,000 I'd gotten from selling my father's vintage tool set. Each of these moves had been painful, but necessary to pay for Karen's emergency surgery. I explained the prenuptial clause we'd negotiated years ago, which explicitly excluded gifts, contributions, or asset transfers made expressly for emergency medical care from marital property. I emphasized my meticulous record-keeping, the bank statements, signed contracts, appraisal documents, and medical expense authorizations, all archived and backed up digitally. Mark listened intently, nodding as I spoke. "Walter," he said, "this prenuptial clause is our strongest weapon. It's a clear legal boundary. Karen's claim on those assets clearly violates that provision because you transferred those funds and assets for her emergency care, which the agreement excludes from any division." He flipped through the documents I'd brought. "The more troubling part for her is your documentation. These records are thorough and consistent. Bank statements showing the exact withdrawal dates and amounts. The Mustang sale contract signed by the buyer with a clear transaction date, and this appraisal report for the tool set from a reputable local appraiser. You've left no room for ambiguity." He paused to sip his coffee, then continued. "Your case rests on two pillars: the contractual exclusion clause and the unassailable evidence tracing every dollar and asset sold. We will compile these into a comprehensive exhibit for the court. We'll demonstrate that these assets were singular contributions to her emergency medical treatment, not marital assets subject to division. I felt a quiet surge of relief. Mark's words confirmed what I had suspected but needed to hear. The legal framework and documentation formed a fortress around my claims, but I also knew this battle wouldn't be won on paperwork alone. Strategy was essential. We began mapping out the plan. Mark advised starting with a chronological inventory of all pertinent documents. The Mustang sale contract, showing the buyer's details, sale price, and date, finalized. Bank withdrawal records from our joint account, stamped and signed by the bank, verifying the $36,500 movement. The appraisal report of my father's toolset, confirming the valuation and sale date. Medical bills and payment authorizations totaling nearly $120,000, precisely matching the funds I'd raised. Emails and correspondence, including those between Karen and her attorney, indicating the timing and intent to file for divorce shortly after her surgery. Helen Carter's affidavit, the family friend's testimony about my financial sacrifices, and Karen's relative detachment during that week. Mark emphasized, every item must be cross-referenced and backed up. We'll prepare a digital database for quick retrieval and presentation in court and mediation. This kind of organization sends a strong message. It shows we're methodical and serious. I took his advice seriously. Back at the motel where I was staying, I spread out all my documents across the small table. The flickering hallway light outside cast long shadows on the files, but inside the room I felt focused and calm. I scanned each receipt and contract, confirming each detail was accounted for with matching dates and signatures. I organized digital backups on a secure encrypted drive and printed duplicate packets to ensure no single point of failure. I then constructed a detailed timeline plotting every key financial event. March 3rd, the Mustang sale finalized. March 4th, withdrawal from the savings account. March 5th, appraisal and sale of the toolset. March 6th through 8th, hospital bills and payments processed. This timeline wasn't just data. It was a narrative of my commitment and sacrifice, a story told in precise dates and dollars. The medical bills and hospital authorizations were equally vital. Every signed form, every insurance claim, every payment confirmation corroborated that the funds were directed strictly toward Karen's emergency surgery. This wasn't a typical marital asset. It was a medical gift, exempted by our contract. Helen Carter's affidavit was the final piece. I'd asked her to detail what she'd witnessed, the exhaustion etched on my face as I juggled hospital visits, calls to appraisers and payments, Karen's emotional detachment, and Max, our dog, who had been my steady companion through the ordeal. Her unbiased testimony would provide the court with an independent account, supporting our claim of financial and emotional imbalance. Mark also suggested we research local custody laws regarding pets, since Karen was claiming custody of Max. He noted that courts often consider the primary caregiver's role, especially during times of crisis. Given Helen's observations and my documented financial responsibility, I had a strong argument for custody. I compiled notes on relevant statutes and case law to discuss with Mark. Over the next days, we drafted the motions to be filed. Mark meticulously crafted language to exclude the emergency medical gifts from the marital estate based on the prenuptial clause. He also prepared to seek temporary custody of Max, backed by Helen's affidavit and my documented care. The motions included exhibits, detailed spreadsheets illustrating the flow of funds and asset transfers, contracts, appraisals, and medical payments. Throughout the process, I maintained a professional calm. This wasn't a battle fought with emotion, but with facts and legal precision. The same discipline I applied to managing the Riverside Bridge project was now the foundation of my defense. Looking at the assembled portfolio, the contracts, bank statements, emails, affidavits, I understood the strength of the position Mark and I had built. Karen's aggressive claim, while initially jarring, was vulnerable to systematic dismantling. The prenuptial agreement wasn't just legalese, it was a shield preserving the sacrifices I'd made. As I prepared for the next steps, filing motions, notifying the court and Karen's counsel, I felt a quiet assurance. This was no longer about loss or betrayal. It was about executing a plan rooted in documentation, law, and strategic patience. The game was on, and I was ready. With the motions carefully drafted and all supporting evidence compiled, I initiated the formal legal process. Mark and I filed the motions with the court, accompanied by a detailed packet including the sale contracts for the Mustang, the appraisal and bill of sale for my father's vintage tools, the bank statements showing the $500 withdrawal from our joint savings, and the mountain of hospital bills and payment authorizations, totaling nearly $120,000. Every document was cross-referenced and annotated to highlight the prenuptial clause, explicitly excluding these emergency medical gifts from marital property division. It was a thick binder of facts and figures, each page a brick in the fortress we were building. With the motions officially submitted, I took immediate steps to notify Karen and her legal counsel of our position. A professional letter was sent outlining the evidence we had gathered, the legal basis for excluding the $118,500 in assets from the marital estate, and the motion to secure temporary custody of Max based on my documented financial responsibility and Helen Carter's affidavit. The tone was measured, factual, and devoid of any personal commentary. This was not a battlefield for recriminations. It was a negotiation table set with cold, unassailable facts. Preparing for mediation became the next critical phase. Mark and I spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence, every clause in our prenuptial agreement, and every detail of Helen's affidavit. We developed a step-by-step strategy, anticipating Karen's possible responses, potential challenges to the validity of documents, and areas where her claim might attempt to circumvent the medical expense clause. Mark advised me to maintain a calm and professional demeanor throughout, emphasizing that emotional detachment would be the key to projecting credibility in mediation. I concentrated on controlling my own mindset, grounding myself in the professionalism that had defined my career. This wasn't just a legal dispute, it was a test of discipline and strategic patience. The motel room where I had taken refuge, with its flickering hallway lights and thin walls, became my planning headquarters. Each night I reviewed the timelines and spreadsheets, rehearsed my responses to possible counter-arguments, and visualized navigating the mediation table with calm precision. Meanwhile, I remained fully cooperative with the court and legal procedures. I responded promptly to requests for additional documentation and provided notarized copies of Helen's affidavit without delay. Mark and I agreed that transparency and responsiveness would reinforce our position, demonstrating respect for the process and a readiness to play by the legal rules. I knew that showing professionalism in every interaction could subtly influence the court and opposing counsel, building a narrative of reasoned authority rather than emotional turmoil. Karen, it seemed, was unprepared for the strength of our position. Her legal team initially reacted with surprise upon receipt of our motion packets. Rumors filtered through my contacts that she was scrambling to reassess her strategy, but remained adamant in her demands. Despite this, her approach appeared increasingly aggressive, filing counterclaims and doubling down on her custody demand for Max. It was clear she hadn't anticipated the prenuptial agreement's legal power, nor the detailed documentation we had amassed. I sensed that her determination was more about intimidation than a realistic assessment of her position. To further demonstrate my financial hardship and commitment to Max's well-being, I documented my temporary living situation at the motel. Receipts for nightly stays at the modest $39 motel were carefully kept, along with written logs of daily routines, walks with Max, visits to the vet, and management of household bills. This record was intended to reinforce the argument that, despite the upheaval, I remained the primary caregiver and had maintained financial responsibility even under difficult circumstances. As mediation day approached, Mark and I rehearsed possible scenarios. We prepared counterpoints to Karen's likely arguments, emphasizing the legal inadmissibility of the emergency medical assets as marital property and the weight of Helen's independent testimony on my behalf. Our strategy was to present a well-structured, documented case that would leave little room for negotiation on these points, while remaining open to discuss Max's custody in a way that prioritized his best interests. Throughout this process, I remained detached from the personal betrayal, focusing instead on the systematic unraveling of Karen's claims through facts and legal principles. The same analytical mindset that had driven my career was now guiding my steps in the courtroom and mediation room. I understood that patience was as crucial as preparation, that the slow, deliberate application of pressure through evidence and law would build momentum toward a favorable outcome. The motions were filed, the court and opposing counsel duly notified, and the mediation scheduled. Every detail had been anticipated, every document accounted for. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, I knew this was only the beginning of a complex dance, a procedural battle where law, evidence, and professional composure would decide how much of what I sacrificed would remain mine, and whether Max would stay by my side. In that small motel room, surrounded by stacks of paper and digital files, I found a strange sense of empowerment. The betrayal felt less like a personal wound and more like a problem to solve. The plan was clear: stay professional, stay patient, and let the systematic process of law and evidence work in my favor. The next chapter awaited: mediation, negotiation, and the slow dismantling of Karen's improbable claims. Karen's legal team faltered quickly once the strength of our evidence was laid bare. Their initial confidence, evident in the aggressive divorce petition, began to waver under the scrutiny of the prenuptial clause and the mountain of meticulously organized financial records supporting my position. The $185,500 in assets I had liquidated for her emergency surgery, the sale of the Mustang, the draining of our joint savings, and the sale of my father's vintage tool set, were not only well documented but explicitly excluded from marital property by our prenuptial agreement. This legal shield wasn't something Karen's lawyers seemed prepared to overcome. At our first mediation session, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The opposing counsel attempted to assert that the money was marital property due to the joint nature of some accounts and the fact that Karen had resided in the home until recently. They argued that regardless of the prenuptial clause, the assets were part of our shared estate. But as Mark laid out the timeline and presented the contracts, bank statements, and medical bills, the claim started to unravel. The judge's questions during the session reflected a clear understanding of the prenuptial protections and the importance of documented evidence. Helen Carter's affidavit proved invaluable. Her detailed account of my financial sacrifice and Karen's relative disengagement during the crisis painted a vivid picture of the imbalance in contributions. Helen described how I had coordinated payments, arranged appraisals, and managed hospital logistics, while Karen seemed more focused on recovery than finances. The affidavit was the kind of unbiased testimony that added real weight to our case, and it visibly unsettled Karen's legal team, who had no comparable witnesses. Perhaps most telling was the revelation of Karen's sudden pivot toward trying to negotiate a private settlement. After the mediation session, Mark informed me that Karen's counsel had reached out, indicating a willingness to drop custody claims over Max if we agreed to certain financial concessions. It was clear her team was scrambling to find leverage, but I maintained my professional distance, referring all communications through Mark. I knew that any settlement would have to respect the prenuptial clause and the evidence we'd compiled, not just Karen's demands. Meanwhile, Karen's efforts to assert full custody over Max were weakening. Helen's observations about Karen's neglect during the critical recovery phase, combined with my consistent presence and financial responsibility, gave us a strong position. I kept detailed logs of daily care routines, vet visits, and expenses, which Mark planned to submit if custody became contested. The combination of documented financial sacrifice and caregiving painted a comprehensive picture of my role as Max's primary guardian. Throughout this phase, I remained calm and measured. My communication with Mark was frequent and focused solely on facts and strategy. I was careful not to let personal feelings cloud my judgment. After all, this was a professional challenge requiring a professional response. The more I observed Karen's increasingly erratic legal maneuvers, the more convinced I became that patience and documentation would be the ultimate weapons. I recall one particularly pivotal moment during mediation, when Karen's attorney attempted to introduce vague claims about emotional contributions and shared sacrifices, trying to downplay the explicit financial evidence. Mark responded firmly, pointing to the prenuptial agreement and the lack of any documented financial input from Karen during the surgery period. The court appeared to side with our evidence-driven argument, signaling that emotional appeals wouldn't sway the legal protections we'd established. Meanwhile, Karen's legal team grew visibly frustrated as we systematically dismantled their claims. The prenuptial clause was cited repeatedly in filings, leaving little room for ambiguity. The documentation of every dollar spent, every asset sold, every bank transaction was an unassailable narrative of unilateral sacrifice. Our case wasn't just theory. It was an exhaustive, verifiable record. This growing pressure led Karen's counsel to propose mediation terms that seemed increasingly desperate, offering to cede dog custody in exchange for financial concessions, suggesting payment plans for any disputed assets, and even implying potential withdrawal of some claims. I passed these offers to Mark without comment, knowing that any negotiation had to preserve the integrity of the prenuptial protections and the financial sacrifices I had made. In parallel, I continued to document every interaction, every proposal, and every expense related to Max's care and my temporary motel stay. Receipts for motel nights, vet bills, and even notes about walks in the park with Max were carefully logged and backed up digitally. This ongoing documentation wasn't just about proving financial hardship. It was about demonstrating consistent responsibility and stability in a situation where Karen's sudden departure suggested otherwise. Despite the mounting legal pressure, I noticed that Karen's emotional distance seemed to grow more pronounced. Our mutual acquaintances reported that she was increasingly isolated, the abrupt divorce and legal battles straining long-standing relationships. It was a reminder that this wasn't just a financial dispute. It was a fracture that had deep personal consequences. Yet, for me, the focus was clear. Maintain calm professionalism, build the strongest possible case, and let the systematic legal process deliver justice. As the mediation sessions progressed, it became evident that Karen's legal team was no longer fully confident in pursuing the emergency assets claim. The prenuptial clause and my evidence formed a fortress they couldn't breach. I kept detailed notes of each session and counsel communication, ensuring no detail would be overlooked if the case escalated to trial. Through all this, I never lost sight of the core reality. The $108,500 in liquidated assets was my sacrifice for Karen's life-saving surgery, not a divisible marital asset. My calm, methodical approach and comprehensive documentation were steadily eroding the foundation of her legal claims. The first true cracks were appearing in what had once seemed an overwhelming assault on my financial and emotional stability. The battle was no longer a question of if, but how the courts would recognize and enforce the protections we had built. And with the legal groundwork in place, I felt the momentum shifting steadily in my favor. Yet, I remained focused on the next steps, knowing that every document, every testimony, and every legal motion was a piece in a larger puzzle that could only resolve through continued strategic pressure. This phase, the faltering of Karen's legal team and the weakening of her claims, marked a turning point. The foundation of my case, built on prenuptial clarity and ironclad documentation, was proving stronger than her sudden, opportunistic demands. But the story was far from over. There were more moves ahead, and the outcome depended on sustaining this professional rigor through what promised to be a complex, drawn-out process. The wheels of the legal process began to turn decisively after Mark and I submitted our motions, loaded with every piece of evidence meticulously gathered over those relentless days. The judge assigned to our case was a seasoned jurist, known for his no-nonsense approach and keen eye for contractual detail. As the court reviewed our filings, I felt the familiar, steady pulse of preparation settle into the quiet confidence of someone who knows their facts are sound. When the temporary injunction was granted, protecting the $118,500 in emergency medical assets from being divided as marital property, it was a critical victory, not just legally but psychologically. This injunction meant the court recognized the strength of the prenuptial clause and the irrefutable documentation supporting our position. It was a clear message that these assets, resulting from my sacrificial liquidation of personal property and savings, were shielded from division. I remember receiving the formal order in an email notification from Mark's office. The words on the screen, "Temporary injunction granted," felt like the first solid foothold in a steep climb. But this was only the beginning. The court's attention also turned to the contentious issue of Max's custody. with Karen's petition demanding the dog and our mutual friend Helen Carter's affidavit, highlighting my constant care and financial responsibility during Karen's hospitalization, the judge moved to order mediation focused on the pet's custody. The judge's preliminary ruling favored me based on the documented caregiving role I maintained throughout the ordeal, a risk factor Karen's legal team had underestimated. While these rulings offered a tactical edge, the bigger battle was unfolding behind the scenes. Karen's legal team, initially aggressive and confident, now showed signs of strain. The prenuptial clause we'd relied on was cited repeatedly in our filings and hearing transcripts, and the avalanche of bank statements, sale contracts, and medical bills left little room for ambiguity. It was clear they hadn't anticipated the depth of preparation or the legal muscle the clause would flex. At the same time, Mark uncovered troubling financial disclosures in Karen's filings, undisclosed credit card debts, and significant unpaid balances that had not been declared during the initial discovery. These revelations further weakened her position, giving us additional leverage in negotiations and before the court. It was a reminder that legal battles are often as much about what isn't said as what is. Throughout this phase, I maintained a composed, professional demeanor. Each communication with Karen's counsel was routed through Mark, who ensured no missteps or emotional reactions could be exploited. I kept detailed logs of all interactions, maintaining a clear record to counteract any potential claims of bad faith or obstruction. One evening, as I sat in the modest motel room with Max curled beside me, I reviewed the latest court transcripts and legal correspondence. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional distant sound from the hallway. The faint flicker of the hallway light cast long shadows, but inside, the atmosphere was one of focused determination rather than despair. I reminded myself that patience and professionalism were my strongest allies, just as in every project I'd managed. Mark prepared to file a motion to formally exclude the emergency medical assets from the marital estate and requested the court to grant me temporary custody of Max pending full resolution. The motion was comprehensive, citing the prenuptial clause verbatim and including every piece of evidence, from receipts and contracts to Helen's affidavit and the medical bills. The legal language was precise and unyielding, the kind of documentation that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Meanwhile, Karen's legal team countered with aggressive motions attempting to undermine the affidavit's credibility and challenge the exclusion clause's applicability. They argued that the funds, coming from a joint account and involving shared property, should be considered marital assets, but their challenge lacked substantive evidence to counteract our documentation and the prenuptial agreement's clarity. I was acutely aware of the stakes involved, not just the financial assets, but the principle of honoring clear agreements and protecting the sacrifices I had made. The court's temporary injunction and custody order were early signs that justice, when buttressed by facts and professionalism, could prevail. Yet I also understood these were tactical victories in a longer legal process, each step laying the groundwork for eventual final rulings. The legal trap we'd set was springing shut on Karen's claims, and the momentum was shifting decisively. The judge's instructions for mediation underscored the need to resolve custody disputes amicably, but the financial issues would require further hearings and possibly trial. I spent evenings preparing with Mark, reviewing potential counterarguments and ensuring every detail was accounted for. This was the professional grind I knew well, methodical, demanding, and exacting. While the outside world might see divorce as chaos and heartbreak, for me, it had become a matter of process, evidence, and strategy. The same traits that allowed me to lead multi-million-dollar engineering projects were now the tools with which I defended my rights and rebuilt my future. The temporary injunction and custody mediation order were signs that the system was responding to the rigor of preparation and the clarity of legal protections. As the next court dates approached, I felt no triumph, only resolve. The battle was intensifying with new challenges surely ahead, but I was ready. The foundation was laid, the emergency medical assets were protected, Max's care was recognized, and the legal framework was firmly in our favor. The interplay of law and documentation was closing the distance between betrayal and justice, one calculated motion at a time. Karen's world began to crumble beneath the weight of the evidence, and the legal forces meticulously aligned against her. The initial shock of her divorce filing had given way to a cold, relentless unraveling, not just of her financial claims, but of her credibility, her standing with friends and family, and her future prospects. The court's reaction was unequivocal. The judge ordered her to pay a significant portion of the legal fees incurred from the proceedings. This was no small burden. The mounting debts and court costs alone sent ripples through her already fragile financial situation. The exposure of her undisclosed credit card debts was a particularly damaging blow. During the discovery phase of the divorce, Mark uncovered several substantial balances that Karen had failed to report. These hidden debts not only weakened her negotiating position, but also cast doubts on her transparency and trustworthiness in the eyes of the court. Creditors began to call, and the impact on her credit score was swift and unforgiving, plummeting to levels that would make securing future loans or renting property increasingly difficult. Karen's financial isolation deepened at a time when stability was critical. Public and private circles alike started to distance themselves. Mutual friends, once caught in the middle of our marital troubles, began to quietly withdraw. Rumors circulated, fueled by the details that emerged in court filings and affidavits. Karen's opportunistic move to claim half the assets she had clearly not contributed to was seen less as a justified demand and more as a cynical grab at what she hadn't earned. Even those who had once sympathized with her health struggles found it hard to reconcile her actions with the sacrifices I had made. The social strain was palpable. Invitations to gatherings stopped coming, calls went unanswered, and the warmth that had once characterized family events grew cold and distant. I heard from Helen that Karen's interactions with close friends had become terse and defensive, a stark contrast to the openness she once displayed. The emotional toll was undeniable, but I remained detached, observing these developments through a lens of professional calm, aware that each ripple of consequence strengthened my position. Legally, the court's demeanor shifted decisively in my favor. Karen's custody claim for Max, our dog, was steadily weakening. Helen's affidavit, detailing Karen's neglect during her recovery and my steadfast care, became a cornerstone of the custody argument. I had kept detailed logs of Max's daily routines, vet visits, and expenses, all of which were presented with precision. The court recognized that Max's well-being was best secured by remaining with me, where stability and financial responsibility were documented and unambiguous. Meanwhile, the prenuptial clause excluding gifts for emergency medical care from marital property was repeatedly cited in filings and hearings. The judge's rulings reflected an understanding of this provision's intent and enforceability. Karen's attempts to circumvent this clause were met with skepticism, as the evidence was overwhelming. Every dollar of the $118,500 in liquidated assets was traced with clarity from the Mustang sale to the withdrawal from savings and the sale of the tool set. Each transaction carefully documented and authenticated. The legal pressure mounted as Karen's options narrowed. Her attorneys, visibly frustrated, began to push for private settlement talks, signaling their awareness of the weakening case. Offers were made to drop the dog custody claim in exchange for financial concessions, but I remained firm, channeling all communications through Mark. Any negotiation had to respect the legal protections shielded by the prenuptial agreement and the documented facts. There was no room for compromise that would undermine that foundation. Karen's financial difficulties compounded as court orders mandated payments toward legal fees, and her credit status impeded access to new credit lines. The cumulative effect was a persistent erosion of her financial independence, making her increasingly reliant on uncertain settlement negotiations. With mounting debts and dwindling social support, her personal and financial isolation deepened, a stark contrast to the professional steadiness I maintained. Media attention, though not widespread, began to surface in local legal circles. The case was quietly noted for its precedent-setting approach to emergency medical fund exclusions in divorce asset divisions. Divorce attorneys and financial planners started referencing the case as an example of how meticulous documentation and prenuptial agreements could protect against opportunistic claims. This professional recognition underscored the broader implications beyond our personal dispute. As Karen faced this multifaceted unraveling, financially, socially, and legally, the landscape of the divorce shifted dramatically. The initial shock of betrayal had given way to a calculated, evidence-driven dismantling of her claims, a process I navigated with the same precision and calm that had defined my career. The legal and professional consequences converged, steadily tipping the scales toward vindication and protection of my sacrifices. Yet even as Karen's credibility and claims faltered, I understood this was a phase, not a conclusion. The process continued, demanding continued diligence and strategic patience. Every court hearing, every document filed, every testimony offered would carry the weight of this unraveling, and the responsibility to maintain professional composure and systematic rigor. The next steps loomed ahead, and the game was far from over. The final court rulings marked a decisive turning point in an ordeal that had stretched far beyond the confines of a typical divorce. After months of painstaking preparation, countless legal motions, and a series of tense mediation sessions, the judge handed down decisions that not only validated the prenuptial agreement's protections, but also recognized the full extent of my financial sacrifices. The liquidated assets, the proceeds from the Mustang sale, the $6,500 withdrawn from our joint savings, and the $12,000 from selling my father's vintage tool set were legally confirmed as my sole property, explicitly excluded from the marital estate. The ruling was unambiguous. These funds were gifts made in the context of emergency medical care, shielded by the contract I had so carefully documented. I remember sitting in the sterile courtroom, the muted chatter of legal aids and the soft shuffle of paper, the only sounds as the judge read the verdict. The weight of every receipt, contract and affidavit I had compiled now carried the full authority of the law. The judge's voice was steady, referencing the prenuptial clause by name and emphasizing the clarity of the documentation. It was a professional validation of the countless hours I'd dedicated to preserving every detail, every transaction that traced the flow of funds used for Karen's surgery. Equally significant was the ruling on Max's custody. The court recognized that my financial responsibility, day-to-day caregiving, and the affidavit from our longtime friend Helen Carter established a stable and nurturing environment for our dog. Karen's petition for full custody was denied. Max would remain with me. The judge noted the importance of continuity and the well-being of the pet, underscoring how the evidence of neglect during Karen's recovery period factored heavily into the decision. It was more than just a legal win. It was a personal affirmation that in the midst of upheaval, I had maintained my commitment to those dependent on me. The rulings also carried financial repercussions for Karen. She was ordered to pay $12,500 in court costs, a sum that underscored the court's disapproval of her attempts to claim assets clearly excluded by our prenuptial agreement. This judgment further strained her already precarious finances, especially given the undisclosed credit card debts uncovered during discovery. The court's decision sent a clear message. Legal obligations and transparency were non-negotiable, and attempts to obscure financial realities would not be tolerated. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of these decisions rippled through my professional life. My attorney, Mark Reynolds, negotiated a favorable severance package with Dalton Engineering, a 15% increase reflecting the emotional and financial toll the divorce had taken. It was an unexpected but welcome gesture of support from my employer, acknowledging not only my contribution to the company, but the resilience I had demonstrated. This negotiation was handled with the same strategic care as every other aspect of my response, grounded in professional respect and clear communication. The case garnered quiet attention within legal and financial circles. Divorce attorneys cited it as a benchmark for the enforceability of prenuptial agreements, especially clauses excluding emergency medical gifts from marital property. Financial planners highlighted the importance of meticulous documentation in protecting individual contributions during marriage crises. This recognition extended beyond personal vindication. It resonated as a subtle but powerful example of how professionalism and preparation can prevail against opportunism. Reflecting on the journey, I saw how each element, the prenuptial agreement, the detailed financial records, Helen's testimony, and Mark's legal expertise, coalesced into a formidable defense. The legal system, often perceived as unpredictable and adversarial, had responded to the clarity and rigor of prepared facts. The outcome wasn't just about recovering assets or custody. It was about reaffirming principles that sacrifice should be recognized, contracts honored, and justice pursued with calm determination. Yet amid the formal victories, there was a quieter, more personal reckoning. The dissolution of the marriage was painful, the betrayal stark, but the process had revealed strengths I hadn't fully acknowledged in myself. My professional skills, the analytical mindset, the capacity for patience under pressure, the discipline of documentation, became tools of resilience and restoration. I had transformed a deeply personal crisis into a systematic effort, guided by reason, evidence, and law. As I transitioned into this new chapter, with a salary boost and a fresh project portfolio at a competing firm, I carried hard-earned wisdom. The ordeal underscored a vital lesson. In the face of personal upheaval, relying on emotions alone is insufficient. Instead, knowing your contracts intimately, documenting sacrifices meticulously, and leveraging legal frameworks strategically can turn vulnerability into empowerment. It's a lesson I now share candidly with colleagues, friends, and anyone navigating the complexities of relationships entwined with finances. The final judgment was not an end, but a pivotal milestone, a moment where preparation met opportunity and justice was served not through confrontation, but through the calm execution of a plan. The path ahead remains open, shaped by the knowledge that professionalism and patience are powerful allies in the face of life's most challenging tests. I'm sitting in my new office, a space that's both unfamiliar and full of promise. The walls are crisp, the lighting modern, and my desk gleams under the soft glow of an adjustable lamp. It's a far cry from the cramped motel room where I spent many sleepless nights, documents spread out like a fortress around me. Now, with a $25,000 salary increase at a competing engineering firm and equity shares in a promising new infrastructure project, I can finally breathe a little easier. But beneath the surface of this professional advancement lies the deeper reflection on the long ordeal that brought me here. When I look back at the months following Karen's surgery and the shock of her divorce filing, I see how every element of my approach, every receipt, every bank statement, every legal brief, was a brick in the wall that protected me. My meticulous documentation wasn't just about numbers and contracts. It was about preserving the truth in the face of betrayal. It was a reminder that even when personal relationships collapse, the systems we build through diligence and forethought can endure and guard us. The $180,500 I sacrificed, the Mustang, the joint savings, and my father's vintage tools weren't just financial figures. They were symbols of trust, legacy, and commitment. Losing them to Karen's demands would have meant erasing the sacrifices I made in the name of love and responsibility. But the prenuptial clause, carefully negotiated years before, became more than legal jargon. It was a lifeline. It turned what could have been a devastating financial loss into a testament to the power of preparation and clarity. Mark Reynolds, my attorney, became more than a legal advisor. His strategic insights and calm professionalism helped me channel my frustration into a methodical approach. Together, we mapped out every step, filed motions, prepared affidavits, gathered witness testimony, and presented a case so airtight that the court had no choice but to recognize the sanctity of the emergency medical assets. Helen Carter's affidavit added a human dimension to the facts, highlighting the imbalance of sacrifice and care during those critical days. It was a powerful reminder that documentation, while essential, is often complemented by the credibility of trusted witnesses. The court rulings were pivotal. Not only did I regain full ownership of the liquidated assets, but I also secured sole custody of Max, our dog, the one constant source of comfort throughout the turmoil. The judge's recognition of my financial responsibility and caregiving role validated the countless walks, vet visits, and quiet moments spent comforting Max during those dark nights. Karen's petition for custody was denied, and she was ordered to pay $12,500 in court costs, a clear message that opportunism and bad faith in legal disputes carry consequences. Professionally, the ordeal took a toll, but also opened new doors. Dalton Engineering acknowledged the emotional strain I'd endured, and through Mark's negotiation, I secured a 15% increase in my severance package. This financial acknowledgement was more than compensation. It was a sign of respect for my resilience and dedication. The new firm I joined recognized my value, not just as an engineer and project manager, but as someone who can navigate crisis with composure and strategy. Equity shares in the new project portfolio symbolize a fresh start, one built on lessons learned and strength gained. Beyond the courtroom and career, this experience reshaped my perspective. I've come to understand that professionalism and personal integrity aren't mutually exclusive. They are intertwined. The same discipline that guided me through multi-million-dollar projects sustained me through personal upheaval. The keys were patience, documentation, and unwavering calm. I learned that emotions, while valid, must be balanced with strategy and facts when stakes are high. I often share this with colleagues and friends now. Know your contracts intimately. Document every sacrifice clearly and comprehensively. And when faced with betrayal or injustice, lean on legal frameworks and strategic patience rather than reacting impulsively. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about steady, principled action rooted in truth and preparedness. The case even garnered quiet recognition in legal and financial circles, cited as an example of how prenuptial agreements with clear clauses and thorough documentation can protect individuals in marriage dissolutions involving emergency medical expenses. It's a small but meaningful legacy, proof that professionalism can influence broader industry practices. In quieter moments, I still feel the weight of what was lost. The marriage, the trust, the history embedded in that Mustang, and those tools. But I also feel gratitude for the resolve I found, and the professional rigor that led me through it. I am no longer just a man betrayed. I am a man rebuilt through calculated patience and strategic action, standing on firmer ground than ever before. The future is open, shaped by the knowledge that even when life's plans unravel unexpectedly, the deliberate application of skill, clarity, and calm can transform adversity into opportunity. I am Walter Knight, engineer, strategist, survivor, and I'm ready for what comes next.